Thank you. So the recording's on and people are still posting their favorite places. I see a lot of water kind of things, island, the coast, the sea, but also mountains. Nice, a lot of outdoor places. Okay. I wanted to start off with some introductions. So we're very happy that so many of you joined us today for the webinar to celebrate our special issue coming out. It's the dynamic nature of student sense of belonging, special issue in studies in higher education. And we're here today with almost all of the authors. I will tell a little bit more about that later. To tell you about the papers that are in the special issue and hopefully to get some conversation going about a sense of belonging, the dynamic nature of sense of belonging, and how we might learn from what's inside the special issue. So to let you know that the session will be recorded. So if you don't want to be visible on the recording, make sure to keep your camera off. And also keep your camera and mic off for the first part of this webinar. I think that might be a good way to make sure that we have the attention for the papers that are coming up. So let me show you what our idea is for today. So we're going to start with some introductions, what I'm doing right now. Then we'll have pitches from each of the authors of the papers. They'll prepare a one slide to give you an overview of what's inside their paper and to make sure that we are all informed for the panel discussion that will follow after that. The panel discussion, we have two guiding questions prepared, and we will have a discussion amongst the authors. And after that, we'll have a Q&A session with whoever has a question and wants to join in on the discussion. Especially the Q&A session will have more space for the practical implications. The panel discussion will dive more into the methods and the results of the papers. Then there's a chat. We have the chat function. David is here to moderate the chat. So if you have any questions, David will make sure that those get forwarded to me. Then by the end, we'll also have our contact information on the final slide. So if you want to be in touch afterwards, feel free to reach out. So that's the program for this next hour. Then I wanted to introduce to you the papers that are in the special issue. First off, we have Ghislaine with her paper on sense of belonging in higher education, effect of early introductory activities. She's here and will present. Then Anne-Roos Verbree is here. Julianne Viola. Petrie Van Der Zanden will present about our paper. And then David Gilani and Jente De Coninck. And then Hanan Farah unfortunately couldn't join us, but I will tell you a little bit about their paper after this. And then finally, Aike, she will end with the pitches. So just to give a shout out to the paper by Hanan Farah. This is a really interesting paper called Navigating Sacred and Secular, the Dynamic Evolution of Muslim Students' Sense of Belonging in UK Higher Education. And what's interesting about this paper is that it dives into sense of belonging as dynamic, but also through racialization and Islamophobia as key concepts. And in this paper, they use the Muslim Identity Intersectional Matrix, which is a model that helps to identify specific risks that especially Islamic students can face in the transition to university. And what they did in their paper is that they dived into how these students transition into higher education, and they identified various phases with various key dynamics in those phases. And the paper really gives you an insight into what's going on at your institution, but also how, as an institution, you can tap into these mechanisms. And they conclude with saying that their findings position belonging as an institutional accomplishment rather than a private affective state. So they really dived into the structural mechanisms around sense of belonging. And they saw that across participants' account, belonging was repeatedly produced, suspended, and reworked through arrangements that institutions had. So it supports a shift in belonging scholarship away from the affective fit towards more of the institutionally mediated judgment distributed through time, space, and power. So I think this is a very interesting perspective that this paper poses. That's make sure to read it if you have a chance. And then I'd like to move on to the pitches from these papers that are listed here. And we're going to start with Ghislaine. So let me put your slide here.
Yes, thanks for the introduction.
There we go.
I'll try to stick to the 3 minutes. I'll do my best. So for our study, we had 2 aims. The first one was to investigate the effect of participation in an introduction week on students' sense of belonging. And the introduction week that we studied was offered every year, open to all students regardless of backgrounds, and including Dutch, which was the context of our study, the Netherlands, and international students. And our study is unlike most previous studies, which mostly focus on interventions to target groups, subgroups of students, such as ethnic minorities or first-generation students, and mostly done in the US. And we also wanted to see how sense of belonging develops throughout the students' first year in higher education. So we asked participants, first-year students, to complete surveys in the first year of the academic year, which was the week after the introduction week, that they did or did not participate in. 1 month into the academic year and 8 months into the academic year. And we used our newly developed scale, sense of belonging in higher education, to measure sense of belonging. And it distinguishes between 3 dimensions, which is sense of belonging with fellow students, the university, and teachers. And we are currently working on a paper on the measurement instrument, also including a validation study, which will hopefully be published this year in the summer. So what did we found in this study? We found that students who attended the introduction week on average reported stronger belonging with fellow students, but not more belonging on the other dimensions. And regardless of attendance, we found that the mean level of belonging with fellow students increases throughout the year, and that non-attendees were close to belonging level of attendees by the end of the year, but they did not manage to fully catch up. With regards to belonging to the university, it had decreased slightly by the end of the year. We don't know why, but this happened, and it's only compared to the start of the academic year. International students also felt a stronger sense of belonging to the university, and first-generation students had a weaker sense of belonging to the university. But this difference between first-generation and not first-generation students was not as big as we would expect from research from the US. And you might have noticed that sense of belonging with teachers dimension is not on the slide. The reason is that we did not find any significant effects, not of attendance, not over time, not across groups of students, subgroups of students. So I think that's it for now. Shall I pass on to Anne-Roos?
Perfect, thanks, yes. Yes, thank you. I'm just turning on my mic. Yes, it works, I guess. Thank you, Ghislaine and Tamara, for the introduction, and giving the word to me. I would like to quickly introduce myself, and I will also try to keep to the 3 minutes. I'm Anne-Roos Verbree, and I work at the University Medical Center in Utrecht, where I'm doing my PhD into students' sense of belonging and authenticity in higher education, which I'm in the final stage of. And the research that's presented in this special issue was actually sparked by a quantitative study into the experiences of students' sense of belonging and authenticity, so the extent they can be themselves in higher education, where we looked at whether there were differences between those student groups, for example, by religion, disabilities, ethnic minority background. And this study led to interesting insights into the differences in experiences among those students. I can also share it in the chat later if you're interested. It's published. But it also sparked many questions about what shaped their experiences, and why these some student groups experience lower belonging and authenticity than other students. And that's why we initiated an in-depth interview study to gain more insight into especially the situational and dynamic nature of these concepts. We did this based on the social ecological model, and we did an inquiry into 21 diverse students' sense of belonging and authenticity. And the figure presents a bit what kind of different aspects shape their experiences. I don't have time to go through all of them, but they present some, the multiple levels that different aspects can act on to shape the experiences of these students. And the influences were also many, but also ranging in how fixed or situational they were, and there were also more proximal to more distal aspects or factors that shape their experiences. And that makes it also a complex issue, I think, to study sense of belonging. Also because I sometimes do get questions like, what kind of intervention can I do to mostly foster students' sense of belonging, which is difficult to answer because there are so many influences on their experiences. And I think that's important to take away from, at least what I took away from this study and also from some of the others in this special issue, to take into account for both practice and further research, that it's important to know that it's not one-dimensional static concepts, but it's both authenticity and belonging are very concepts that are complex and shaped in multiple ways. And also that authenticity is important besides sense of belonging, that it's also important not only to fit in, but also to be your authentic selves. And we actually are also currently doing a diary study in which students completed a 7-day diary to look more into this dynamic and situational nature. Well, I don't have time to share more about it, but I wanted to share this with you to have a brief insight into the study we did for this special issue. Thank you. Thanks, Anne-Roos. And then we move to the next paper. That's by Julianne.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for today. My name is Julianne Viola, and I am a researcher at Imperial College London, where I have been collaborating with my co-authors Luke McCrone and Martin Kingsbury on belonging research and evaluation at Imperial College London since 2019. And we began this research 7 years ago in alignment with Imperial's learning and teaching strategy at that time. This, alongside the unfolding context and agenda in the United Kingdom higher education to widen access and participation in university among students from underrepresented backgrounds, really underscored the importance of supporting a strong sense of belonging for all students at university. Initially, we set out to understand the nature and extent of students' sense of belonging at Imperial, as well as the relationship between the financial, social, and academic experience of students who received the means-tested Imperial bursary using longitudinal interviews and questionnaires. And this paper in this special issue focuses on and presents the findings from the interviews only. The longitudinal interviews emphasize that belonging changes over the student life course, depending on different factors that also evolve over time. Through abductive thematic analysis of 117 interviews with 48 students over 5 years, it became very clear that connection and connecting were themes that students discussed both implicitly and explicitly as important to their sense of belonging while at university. Students also experienced a greater sense of connection and desire to connect based on how empowered they were to make these connections. In this paper, we offer some conceptual contributions to our field of study, which includes our definitions of connection and empowerment, which have really shaped our understanding of belonging as not only dynamic, but agentic as well. We define connection as an ongoing active process of interaction and empowerment as choice and agency to interact. Recognizing that belonging is a dynamic, agentic process shaped by the evolving factors, which are illustrated in figure 2 of our paper, can better enable students to express themselves authentically and create connections that are meaningful to them and enhance their sense of belonging at university. This approach has helped us at Imperial to influence policy and practice at an institutional level, for example, in making recommendations for the design and implementation of programs to support students in their transition to university, and by providing evidence to support the continuation of Imperial's means-tested bursary because of its long-term impact as a connecting factor. This approach has also helped us to reframe and rethink our own sense of belonging in our research group, in our department, and in the institution as staff members, and has changed the way that I personally think about and experience belonging myself. I'll now pass over to the next author.
Thanks, Julianne, and we move to Petrie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Petrie Van Der Zanden, and I'm from the Radboud University in the Netherlands. I would like to present something about the study that I conducted with Tamara and also with Pauline Meijer. In our study, we focused on the development of student sense of belonging during the first semester in the first year at university. And our aim was to gain more insight into 3 things. So first, about how students' sense of belonging develops over time. Second, what students themselves consider the most important elements of their sense of belonging. And third, also about the key experiences or moments that shape students' sense of belonging. And to explore this, we conducted semi-structured interviews with students, and we used metaphor cards to help students express their feelings about their first semester. And we also asked them to draw a timeline showing how their sense of belonging developed over time. And what we found was that the timelines varied widely. So some students showed a very steady development, while others experienced more strong fluctuations with the ups and lows. And this highlights that belonging is not a fixed or stable experience, but something that really changes over time. And when we look deeper into what belonging meant to students, we found 4 elements that emerged. Because first, it was the self. Students really described becoming more comfortable with who they are and feeling that they could develop as a person as an element of sense of belonging. They also described the social dimension, so that was more focused on making friends and finding people that they could connect with and feel supported by. We also found an element of academic belonging, because this really referred to how they feel connected to their field of study, but also the content and future profession that they see. And the final element was university, as students became more confident in navigating the university environment. And we found it very interesting that students also often mentioned very similar key moments or key experiences throughout the first semester, such as, for example, lectures, work groups, but also the exam periods. But those moments had very different meanings for students. So for some, they strengthened the sense of belonging at a specific time, while for others, they created feelings of stress, but also feelings of disconnection with their peers. So yeah, what this shows us is that belonging is highly personal and also dynamic, and that the same experience can have very different effects, also depending on how students interpret sense of belonging and what they need at that moment. Thank you.
Thanks. And we move on to David. There we go.
Afternoon, folks. My name is David Gilani. I'm from Middlesex University. I'm presenting this paper that we co-authored with Professor Liz Thomas and Daniel MacArthur when we were at the University of York. So this was a sequential explanatory mixed methods study where we combined surveys with students with longitudinal online diaries, and we looked at the changing patterns of student sense of belonging as reported across the first year of undergraduate study. This was across a couple of different universities. And then once we'd looked at their overall reports of changing sense of belonging and whether we could see any changes across different student demographics, we then looked in more detail at the online diaries that students had been completing alongside their first year to see if we could find any explanations for those changes in sense of belonging. And what we found overall through the study was that there was a slight decline in student sense of belonging across the first year of academic study. But the only demographic variable in our sample where there was a significant difference was across first generation students. So similar to some of the other studies we picked out today. What was really interesting was that first generation students didn't report a belonging gap at the beginning of their journey. It was something that emerged through the first year of study. And through analysis of the online diaries, a few key themes came out in terms of differences that we found between the online diary results of first generation students compared to their non-first gen counterparts, which we thought were particularly interesting or insightful to explain this difference. So those three key things were fragility of peer relationships. Reports from first generation students were much more common to talk about uncertainty in the relationships they've been building with peers during the first year of study, whether those groups, communities, friendships were ones where they could be their authentic selves, whether they were aligned to their goals, to their values. Secondly, was first generation students being much less likely to report that they felt a sense of mattering amongst staff. So there were many more positive comments throughout the research from students about the importance of relationships with staff and moments of mattering where they felt a staff member understood them, their needs, their experiences. These were much less likely to come from first generation students, which perhaps signals less clear understanding or expectations about what relationships with academic staff members within a university setting should look like, compared to non-first generation students who maybe have a better, greater understanding of what those expectations are from staff members because of influences from family members that have been to university and been able to talk about their relationships with staff members. And the final finding, which was particularly interesting, was there was barely no mention of finances, the influence of finances, the cost of living on university experiences amongst first generation students, which could be due to stigma, bias, concern about being able to talk about that topic from students who are traditionally more likely to come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Yes, just seen the comment there from Peter, the Bronfman-Brenner model is something that we've used because we were exploring agency and the dynamics of how much control students have over their own experience, the university, and then wider factors in life as well. And it was really interesting that the mixed methods approach allowed us to look at the changing trends, see that it was first generation students who had this particular dip through the first year, and then use the online diaries, which is a methodology that we particularly recommend to others because it's very accessible as a way to unpick where those differences were coming through the first year of study. So that is our paper. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. And we move on to Jente. There you go.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jente De Coninck. I'm a PhD student at Ghent University in Flanders, Belgium, under the supervision of Professor Wendelin van Tighem, also present here. I saw her name pop up in the attendance list. Hi, Wendelin. And Professor Peter Stevens. And my PhD is all about university belonging of ethnic cultural minority students, which I will be defending in about 1 week from now. So the starting point of our study is a critique of how belonging is often treated as static and as something students either have or do not have. That's a very binary framing, but our study asks a different question. What happens when we understand belonging as something that develops and is continuously negotiated over time? The study is situated in Flanders, Belgium, which provides an interesting context for examining this question because Flanders operates as a relatively open admissions higher education system. Anyone holding a secondary education diploma can enroll in higher education. Tuition fees are relatively low and means-tested study grants are widely available. But we see that ethnic minority students remain underrepresented, experience higher dropout rates, and experience less belonging in university. So to understand this process, we followed 31 ethnic minority students over the course of their first 18 months of their university trajectory, using qualitative research approach, specifically semi-structured interviews conducted across 3 waves. And we then selected 4 cases to capture the widest possible variation. Theoretically, we use Ann and Davis's 4 domains of belonging, social, academic, personal, and surroundings. And we use Archer's conceptualization of agency as reflexivity. Our central finding is that belonging is fundamentally dynamic. Students actively move between stronger and weaker forms of belonging, between social and academic belonging, or any of the other 4 domains of university belonging. Thus, a second key finding is the central role of agency. Students were not passive recipients of belonging or their structural conditions. Through reflexive internal conversation, thus agency, they actively constructed belonging and they could actively prioritize a certain belonging domain over another. For example, the academic domain over the social one. Third, identity emerged as a primary lens through which belonging was interpreted and negotiated. Students continuously reflected on who they were, how they were perceived, and where they fit in within the university environment. And ethnic identity and representation mattered greatly to most students. At the same time, we found that students frequently developed a broader student identity that transcended ethnic differences. This enabled them to feel part of something bigger than themselves and their sub-identities, and they could identify with, recognize, and be recognized by other students as part of the same group or community, which is university students. Overall, the study demonstrates that belonging is not a fixed state, but an ongoing process. By taking a qualitative longitudinal approach, we show how belonging is continuously woven through the interaction of identity, social relationships, institutional structures, culture, and students' own reflexive agency. Thank you. And then I give the floor to Aike, I think.
Yes, thank you, Jente. Hi, everyone. My name is Aike Dias-Broens. I'm currently also finishing my PhD at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. So I'll go right into what we have done. So in this study that I conducted with my colleagues, Marieke Meeuwissen, Marleen de Moor, and Sabine Severins, also from the Erasmus University, we wanted to increase the dynamic understanding of sense of belonging by studying its development and its meaning across the first year, and for students with and without a migration background, and first and continuing generation students in higher education. The students in our sample were first-year bachelor students in social sciences programs, and about 1/3 of the students had a migration background, and about 1/3 was a first-generation in higher education student. So to conduct this study, we used the UB arcs. This is a multidimensional measure that we developed and validated in a very similar student population, and that consists of the dimensions acceptance, recognition, commonality, and peer support. And the methods that we used were linear mixed modeling and longitudinal measurement invariance testing and multi-group measurement invariance testing. It's a lot of complex words together. So longitudinal measurement invariance testing is quite complex and an unknown method, I think. And we use this method to study if the UB arcs assess the same underlying sense of belonging construct throughout the first year. So in other words, how much the meaning students assign to the items that are used to measure belonging changed across this period. And for multi-group measurement invariance testing, we checked whether different groups interpreted the items of the measure in a similar way. So what our findings showed is that in the first half of the academic year, the UB arcs assessed the same underlying sense of belonging construct across time and across different student groups, and that their belonging increased. However, the UB arcs was measurement non-invariant after this period, which indicates that its meaning changed and makes mean comparisons difficult. And in a very simplified way, this kind of is like comparing mean scores between apples and pears. Also, the increase of sense of belonging was not different across different student groups, but students with a migration background consistently reported a lower sense of belonging compared to the students without a migration background. And we did not find this difference for first-generation students. So to round up, from a dynamic perspective on belonging, the findings of measurement non-invariance after the first half year actually make quite some sense to us. Because if you realize that students go through different phases and develop their identity throughout the year, to us it was no surprise after looking back on the results, that their interpretation of aspects of sense of belonging also change, and that different aspects become more or less relevant to their understanding of belonging. And we think this is very important to take forward when longitudinally studying students' sense of belonging. Thank you.
So huge thank you to all of the authors for being exactly in time with all of their pitches. Great job. I see that there, I saw a hand, or maybe not. I want to first move to the panel discussion, which means that there's 2 questions that we prepared, and I want to ask the authors of the papers to answer those questions. And then after those 2 questions, we'll have time to move to the Q&A. So if you have any questions already, maybe you want to put them in the chat or write them down, then we'll move to the panel discussion first and then move on to the Q&A. So here we go with the panel discussion. And the first question is, how did your methods help to move beyond a static understanding of belonging? So if there is any author who wants to kick off the discussion on this question. Yes, Julianne, go ahead.
Thank you so much for the introductory question to our panel. I'm glad to have a chance to reveal a little bit more about our longitudinal interviews. This method, I think, really helped us to move very far beyond a static understanding of belonging to an understanding of belonging as dynamic, because these interviews conducted annually with the same groups, with the same participants, gave us a check-in point with each one of them each year. And during these interviews, participants reflected on the experiences that they had over the past year. And in some cases, participants had even moved onward in their course. And these were reflections about, the year that they had had in university, whereas in other cases, the participant had graduated. And these reflections that they shared in ongoing interviews year on year were reflections about their entire university experience now from their perspectives as alumni. And this reflective process really helped us as researchers and the participants to understand that sense of belonging changes over time, and there are different factors that are experienced by participants that might influence these changes. We explore this in depth in the paper, but I can give 2 quick examples now, and then I'll let another author speak. But for example, one student, Henry, experienced a very strong sense of belonging over time, just from the get-go, and continued to move in a positive trajectory. This sort of started out from his receipt of the means-tested imperial bursary, so a sum of money at the start of the year, which he chose. He had agency to choose how to spend the money, which he chose to spend on computer equipment. And he joined the robotics team. He later hosted and organized hackathons, and he developed his connection to his discipline and to his peers. He also gained confidence and gained leadership skills. And he left Imperial feeling a very strong sense of connection to the students that he connected with, but also with his subject area. On the other hand, another participant, Abdul, started his course at the start of 2020 academic year. So this was peak COVID lockdowns. He was very isolated, and he shared it was very, very difficult for him to make friends. And that initial experience really informed the rest of his sense of belonging throughout the entire rest of his journey. Once classes moved to a hybrid format and more lectures happened in person, he gained more of a sense of connection, but he still felt sort of an overall sense of disconnection from the university. So our methods of these longitudinal interviews really helped us to pinpoint not only that the sense of belonging is dynamic and changes over time, but there are particular factors or experiences that students might have that can be quite connecting or disconnecting for them.
Perfect. I see Jente wanting to respond. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add on to this because I also use longitudinal interviews. I didn't do it like every year, but every semester. And I think it's such an interesting methodology because rather than capturing like isolated experiences, we followed students through like critical transition moments, including the entry into university, the aftermath of the first exams, the beginning of the second year. And this methodological design really allowed us to identify like changes in belonging over time, moments where belonging increased or decreased, shifts between like the domains of university belonging, like social, academic, personal forms of belonging, surroundings domain. We could like see that students were like, oh, I can't find any belonging in the social domain. I can't make any friends, or I need friends with the same ethnic background as me. And we could really pinpoint when that happened and how they chose actively to like create peer networks and peer friendships, but also we could identify evolving identity negotiation, changing strategies students use to navigate. So I think the qualitative methodology allowed us to study not only outcomes, but also deeper lying processes and mechanisms. Instead of simply observing that the student experienced belonging, we could examine how that belonging emerged, what triggered changes, how did students respond to challenges and opportunities. And the qualitative nature of interviews was equally important. It enabled us to access students' reflexive accounts, their internal conversation, doubts, interpretations, decision-making processes. So I think that's interesting how, I think that's why qualitative methodological design is interesting to capture the dynamic nature of belonging. And then I'm going to give the floor to someone else.
Yeah, I see David raised his hand, and then after Ghislaine. So go ahead, David.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I'm very much an advocate for the online diaries methodology, which I mentioned on my slide, and I'll address a couple of questions from Peter and other colleagues joining that you asked in the chat about it. So the diaries methodology is very flexible. There are in-person versions that can be done where students keep a physical journal and a log of their experiences. We opted for the online approach where students are essentially sent out a Qualtrics form that they can respond with written texts, so kind of blogging, they can add in voice notes, they can add in vlogs, and the flexibility is really beneficial because it allows students to respond in the medium through which they feel most comfortable to do so. And then you can decide as kind of the research team whether you're going to analyze across different medium types or transcribe content to allow you to analyze it. So it's very flexible. Also, when we were doing the study, we did a process evaluation at the end, and a very high percentage, I think it was slightly over 80% of respondents said that the process of having a vehicle to reflect on their experiences was in itself positive and contributing to their sense of belonging. So I think there's something about research methods which are also some form of intervention. They actually help students to develop a sense of belonging by giving a trusted, supportive space to have a voice, even if it's just one that they can use with themselves. So I think it's a very versatile method. We used it in a way where students responded about every 3 weeks through the first academic year, completing their diaries. So I think there were 7 instances in total that we collected from the students. And that frequency meant that it was really useful to unpick things like experiences changing across different semesters and modules, when students might be moving across different staff members they were working more closely with, times of the academic year where perhaps some of the social activities and events are very high compared to others where they might kind of slow down a little bit. So yeah, it was really, really useful. We did incentivize students, so we received funding from institutional access and participation plan funding to incentivize students for completing the diaries, which I am sure also did help. But I think if this was embedded within teaching as part of reflective practice within a module, it could also be really effective and then be rolled out more openly for students.
Selena, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So of course, my study and also Aike's study, for example, we developed our own measurement instruments, and there were obviously quantitative measurement instruments. So maybe less dynamic and not able to capture like differences across individual students, fluctuations within students, and so on. At least not in my study. But I think what we both did was capture different dimensions, although they were different dimensions that we found. But I think very similar in like the definition that we used. It just turned out differently. But I think also keeping an eye on the messages in the chat. I think there was one message on the research is always a bit behind. So how do we track like students' well-being, sense of belonging, and when do we start an intervention and on what? I think what a lot of universities are doing is doing some kind of student well-being monitor kind of thing every now and then, like twice a year or every block maybe, so 4 times a year. And I would suggest including sense of belonging questions in there, and also making sure that it includes different dimensions, so multiple dimensions. So you also know when to do an intervention, but also on what kind or what dimension of the construct. For example, in my research, that would be the university dimension or the teacher dimension, since the student dimension already increased over the year. So yeah, for our university in Tilburg, that was okay. But yeah, so you can see throughout the year, when to put some extra effort into fostering student sense of belonging. I think Aike has some additional comments.
Yes, thank you, Ghislaine. What I always find afterwards is really think about representation and the measure that you choose if you do choose to study it quantitatively, to really see if a measure that is used is kind of aligns with your student population, and to maybe also include students in that process of selecting a measure, to make sure that you're actually measuring things or dimensions of belonging that are fitting for your context, which are very different in different countries, different types of universities. So I think that would be a very important thing. And what we try to do in our measure is make it very concrete what we're asking in the item. So to be concrete about the context, the people that are involved in a certain item, so you actually know what students are talking about when they're kind of scoring these items. That's kind of in alignment with what Ghislaine said. And another thing with like the overall question that I wanted to add is we actually, thankfully, Marlene de Moor, she's a methodologist who wanted to be involved in our study, and she actually suggested longitudinal measurement invariance testing, which I had never heard of before. So I think that's also a way that you can check with kind of the people who are very skilled in thinking about methods that are fitting for what you want to study. So that she really helped us in kind of looking at selecting a fitting way of analyzing data.
Yeah, Petrie, go ahead.
Yes, it's also a little bit relates to a question in the chat and also to the previous comments by the authors, because we also found that it's not only the dynamic is not only in the time, for example, about how sense of belonging develops, but also about what students see as sense of belonging about the elements. And that is something that we found also very interesting, because you really see differences in what elements students find important. And for example, the social element is for a lot of students very important when they start their study at the university. But there are also some students who really say that I'm not focused on finding new friends, or I have already a group that I belong to, and they, for example, focus more on the academic elements of sense of belonging. So that is something that we find very interesting, and that students also change on what element they focus on and also move between them. So that's also, I think, a very nice finding that we had.
Okay, so I think it's maybe we can dive more into the questions in the chat now, if that's okay for everyone, because I think there's some important questions in here. So do we, like building on what you're saying, Petrie, that students find different elements to belong, but what does it mean? Like, what do we mean with belong? Do we need every student to belong, and why? I think is a slight summary of what's been asked. Do you have any comments on that? Anne-Roos, go ahead.
Thank you. I think it's a really interesting and also important question whether we want all students to belong and also to what entity. I think it's important that we take that into account in research as well, that you can belong more to your discipline as like your future profession, but also your university or study program in the university, or more the campus as a physical place. So I think there are many different forms which are important to consider in research, and it's probably not necessary or possible to have belonging to all those places. But what I personally find important, besides that, we should probably give room to students that are also having their belonging somewhere else, because, for example, they are parents or do have some kind of student association or other priorities that they have a place to belong somewhere else outside the university. But I think there should be some kind of minimum level, because it's also important in the process of becoming a professional in your field to be able to relate to other people and to work together with others, which is almost always an important part of your future career and profession. So also seen from the side of the learning of objectives of a certain program, I think it's important that students have at least some kind of basic belonging or relatedness to others in order to be able to learn better, which is also an important condition for learning, I believe.
Yeah, other reflections? Go ahead.
I completely agree. And I think something that we have found just from our research over the last 7 years is just how important it is to leave it up to the student as much as possible for them to pursue their own authentic inclinations and connections, however that might look to them, whether it's, becoming really involved in, a salsa club in their, local area and finding belonging there. Maybe they don't feel as connected to their chemistry department, but they're performing well academically because they have a social support network outside of university that helps them to thrive and improves their well-being. So it's all very much connected. And I think the key that we found, and I think that seems to be echoing in the conversations today, is the importance of agency for students to really decide to what they belong and how they are going to sort of experience and exercise that belonging and connection to those different people and groups.
Yes, and I think in line with some of the comments in the chat from Celso and from Simon, maybe others too, then we get to this difficult balance. Like if we do give students agency to define their own pathways of belonging, how as an institution can we still get a view on this? How can we make sure that we have enough opportunities for the students to belong? Can we measure, can we follow them, and how, if it becomes such a diverse and dispersed concept? Any thoughts on that?
I think that what our studies implicate, the implications are that one size fits all intervention doesn't work because it's so different for everyone. And because of that, I think that the universities really need to provide ongoing, more flexible support rather than single interventions, for example, and that they can focus also on those different elements of belonging. So that really, and maybe there can also be some support from the university to help students more actively shape also their own sense of belonging. I think that's more the student agency in creating belonging is very important in this.
Yeah, David, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, just to build on that, and I think what a few people have started to discuss in the chat, I think the way we measure belonging is really important in the sense that we are going to exclude lots of different students' needs and priorities if we use measures which are about things like I'm a member of a student society or I'm on campus 5 times a week. But the scales that do seem to still work and be really reliable predictors of things like student continuation, engagement, and well-being are ones that are based on measures about what students feel and their subjective interpretations of whether they're welcome and accepted in a community. Those do still really strongly predict continuation in most circumstances, even for part-time students, online learners, mature students, because it's about their interpretation of what belonging means for them. And then in terms of what we do about that, yeah, 100% agree on this idea of agency. For me, I think one of the best evidence banks we have of what works when it comes to building student agency is this body of work around social belonging interventions, where you just talk with students about belonging. You talk with them about the different opportunities and ways there are to belonging at university. You talk about how belonging is known to change over time, to go up, to go down, that it's almost inevitable that most students will have a point in their journey where they wobble and think, maybe I'm not meant to be here. And that's not a sign of them not meant to be here. That's just something that a lot of students do go through, and a lot of students get past that point. By normalizing those challenges, by talking with students about belonging and how they can find it in their own way, these interventions, social belonging interventions, tend to show that students then do have a greater, I suppose, certainty around their sense of belonging. Not that their belonging is necessarily higher, but when they do have wobbles or moments where they don't feel they belong, they don't then see that as a reason to leave university all entirely. So I think that's kind of the idea of, by talking with students about it, you can give them that confidence to persist in times where there may be difficulties. I think Aike, then you had your hand up to go next.
Yes, yeah, actually what I wanted to say is very much in line with what you just said, David. And I think one very, very important thing is that the people who are working with students on their belonging do not have kind of fixed ideas about what belonging should look like or what it should be, and that kind of these maybe for some people more traditional ways of what it means to belong, that's not portrayed by a university or someone who's working with students, that they can form their own belonging. I think that's very crucial in especially looking at students who are minoritized, that they don't get a feeling that they only belong if it's in a certain way. I just wanted to add that, that I think that's essential in working with belonging, and also reflecting on that. I think that I don't have experience on it, but I have ideas about it, that reflecting on your own belonging, your history of belonging, that's already a very important part. And I think that's what David also mentioned in his presentation. And I think with his work, with your workshop, that's also shown, like reflection on your own belonging is already something that's very helpful.
Yes, I see in this line of reasoning that becoming is a concept that's being coined in the chat right now. I think we need to give a shout out to Peter van Lamoen here, who has just defended his thesis on belonging and becoming. So if anyone can find it quickly, maybe we can share it here. But maybe there are some of the authors here who have an idea of, like, did you see this in your own research or in maybe a current research project, that becoming so the space for development in the belonging process? Do you recognize this? Or maybe you have a reflection on this?
I can offer a few reflections. I think that university is such a time of transition in the sort of like thinking about being a young person at university for the first time, unless you're a mature student, not to exclude them. But typically undergraduate students in particular are transitioning from childhood through adolescence into adulthood. So in this constant sort of state of becoming and discovering themselves and developing their own identities. And I think there's a lot of intersecting work between belonging and identity in this particular sort of phase in higher education that must be explored even further.
Yeah, Jente, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if this completely links with the becoming, but when I did my interviews with my participants, they always said, "Oh, I don't feel like I belong. I'm the only one with my background, which is an ethnic background or from lower socioeconomic status." And then I asked, like, and maybe can you think about a way that you do belong? And they said, yeah, I don't know if I really belong. And then, oh, you know how I feel a sense of belonging? And I told you about this in the when I did the pitch, and it was the overarching student identity that everybody said, yeah, we're here with the same purpose, we have the same goals, which is obtaining a higher education diploma. And they became a member of the student community. They became a university student, which is an overarching identity in which the ethnic differences between each other decreased, and they could feel like they became part of something bigger than themselves. And I think that's also a link with the becoming as belonging or belonging as becoming that may be interesting to work out even more.
Yeah, I see in the chat that we have also some reflections on how we can measure belonging and how like the measurements, like how big can we make them, how specific can we make them without well, while balancing time and people and effort. So I think this is also a very relevant question. So if we want to move towards, you know, the longitudinal, the qualitative, the arts-based practices, what does it take to do this kind of research? Maybe do we have some reflections on that? Yeah, David, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure it fully answers the question, but I'll give it a go. And it kind of links to the comment I've seen Joanne's popped in around, you know, what are we trying to achieve by measuring belonging? And I think I like the idea of taking a pragmatic approach with it. I think that the longitudinal exploration of belonging is really powerful because it seems to be that actually that it's when students report a change in sense of belonging that you have the best chance to notice that something's going wrong in their student experience. And you can look at that from the perspective of a course team who wants to really be in line with their students and what they're going through so they can put in place immediate changes and respond to student feedback, to institutional leaders who might be worried about metrics, and a change in sense of belonging is a really useful way to potentially predict future issues they might have around continuation. So I don't think personally there is an issue with this being both something that people who are particularly passionate about the topic, like I imagine most people in this webinar are, that belonging has intrinsic value and it's about well-being, and as you know, you said, democratic citizenship and what allows people to speak and support the communities they live in, as well as also being something which is just a really good predictor of the metrics that governments and university managers want to see improve. I think it can be both an end in itself and a means to that end at the same time, and be something that we don't have to that, yeah, we can use positively towards both of those conversations.
Perfect. Thanks so much, David. I think I will take the final minute of this webinar to thank the authors for giving their brilliant pitches and answers to the questions. Thanks to everyone who is here for your questions and discussion in the chat. I'll leave you with some contact information. Again, please read the papers. Feel free to reach out for any follow-up questions, and we'll make sure that the slides and the recording comes back to you for your registration for the webinar. So David will make sure of that. Thanks so much, David. And I'll say have a great day, everyone. Thanks again. It was so nice to have this discussion and see all of you here. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Not sure if the recording is also stopped now.
I do think so, because David is gone, isn't it?
But it's still going because it's counting
Oh yeah,
the top line.
yeah, right.
I can't stop it. No.
I guess I'll just have to leave.
Thank you all very much.
Yes, thanks. It was
a very
great
nice
to
session.
share in this way.
Yeah.
Okay, see you all
Thank you.
later. Bye bye.